There's also things like the attackers can use defensive technologies. Evil people can use.
Yeah.
Testing.
Yeah, somebody who's like
Just come through.
aggressive, right? Who's like maybe not pacifistic, but like who's like, okay, you're gonna be aggressive in all of like the annoying ways. But we're gonna use your same defensive tech to like you can never get rid of us.
Right.
It's like this latent virus, we're gonna be here forever.
I think it knows
It's working?
Using creative hash.
Yeah. Intro for Spencer.
Sure, thanks.
Hi guys, really, really excited to have Spencer here. We've known Spencer since we've ever really gotten started in Web3. He's always been kind of like guiding us and giving us really great feedback. Spencer is a multifaceted individual who's worked in everything from DAO governance tooling, making open source contributions. We first got to know him working together on Lobby 3, which was Andrew Yang's project to basically build out things like an on-chain DAO for taking collective political action. Something that we'll see is probably going to get replaced by things like deep governance, where we just have AI models. So Spencer's here today to talk a little bit about the knowledge commons, and love to hear what you have to say, and really excited to have you here today.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'll say I'm Spencer. I'm going to be talking about the knowledge commons, some of the history and terminology and influences behind this concept. A lot of it is kind of a rejuvenation of a lot of the original semantic web ambitions, with some kind of new enthusiasm due to new technologies like Arweave. Going to talk about, and I'm also going to set the stage with what knowledge commons is, and then introduce this long-term content syndication pattern that would sort of be like an Arweave-based equivalent of RSS. So that's the scope of this presentation. I've got a QR thing here. I've shared a link to the presentation in the Telegram group. I've got some other links and intricate diagrams in here if anyone wants to follow along. But I'll proceed. So what is the knowledge commons? I've got a couple definitions here, one from the OpenCivics wiki, which was written by Patricia Parkinson and Benjamin Life at OpenCivics, and another one from Simon Grant's wiki. He's done a lot of really cool thinking on knowledge commons, especially with a view towards a lot of what is important about semantic web standards. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be thinking of a knowledge commons as an open, universal, informational substrate and the ecosystem of knowledge bases built on top of it that draw from that substrate. So that's sort of the context of what this presentation is, and it's going to cover some of the initiatives going on in JournoDAO and OpenCivics and how they relate to knowledge commons and content syndication. So there's a few influences that go into what a knowledge commons is. A few of these things each have their own kind of rabbit hole of things to nerd out on. Zettelkasten is sort of an analog precursor to a hypertext system. There's been Zettelkasten technique for the last several hundred years. I think it was mostly popularized in the 20th century by this German sociologist named Niklas Luhmann. So I've got a link there that goes to one of the main kind of hubs of Zettelkasten knowledge. This is mostly personal knowledge management to like surface unforeseen connections between your notes and your ideas. We have digital gardens, which I think are relatively recent. What comes to mind for me here is Maggie Appleton. I think she's popularized a lot of these ideas. She may have even coined the term digital garden. I'm not sure, but I've got some other information about that here. You can sort of think of this as like a cozy web post-enshittification blog.
Enshittification, like shit posting, or?
Yeah, I think Cory Doctorow coined this term of like the corporatization of the internet and how the experience sort of really diverged from what the original semantic web vision of what the internet could be. And now it's like our attention is being monetized, and it's sort of like we're reluctantly the product in this whole system in certain ways. So like that whole kind of large trend of experientially how the internet has degraded in certain ways is called enshittification. He coined that term. And so this is sort of a return to like an enthusiastic, cozy web kind of tending your little corner of the internet. It could be an individual knowledge garden or a digital garden. It could be a community garden, but it's sort of a very intentional and care-based practice that's essentially a successor to the whole blogosphere movement. And so a lot of stuff like Obsidian, Quartz, which we'll be getting into, is very much in this trend of digital gardens. And lastly, we have discourse graphs, or knowledge graphs more broadly, I think is what would apply to this. Zettelkasten is sort of an analog knowledge graph. I'll be getting into this at the end with potential for on-chain knowledge graphs, which ties into a lot of DeSci stuff and nano publications. But these are kind of three main trends that are feeding this enthusiasm around the knowledge commons. And so you add in other stuff like the whole DAO movement and can a community collectively govern their knowledge base, and what would that look like? That whole kind of realm of considerations is what this knowledge commons frontier is. So there's some context, and this is kind of at a high level what it amounts to if you look at it as an equation. So a lot of semantic web vision of things, very highly queryable and rich information architecture, stuff like RDF, knowledge graphs, having it be user-friendly and non-technical. That's where a lot of tools like Obsidian come in. So you can really have this intricate personal knowledge base without needing to be a programmer or create your own site. Tools like Quartz and Obsidian Publish make it pretty easy to publish your own wiki from your Obsidian graph. And then the collective creation, curation, and syndication, and how that can learn from the DAO movement, this is what kind of changes it from an individual knowledge base or knowledge garden to a community one, is if there's collective contribution to it. So this is like the big picture of what we're talking about with knowledge commons, as like an ecosystem of community knowledge bases that I think would benefit from some shared informational infrastructure like Arweave. So that's what I'm going to be getting into next. This particular like example architecture of what a community knowledge base could look like. People can use Obsidian or any text editor that they like, but Obsidian's really conducive to this for creating and organizing content. Quartz is essentially a free open source equivalent to Obsidian Publish. It's a static site builder that takes a directory of markdown files and turns them into HTML files and preserves internal links. So you can build your own wiki this way. And then Arweave is good for long-term storage. It's comparable to IPFS, but I think IPFS is more optimized for shorter-term things that you pay as you go. Whereas with Arweave, notionally, you pay once and it's there 200 years, or a plausibly permanent storage, hence plausibly permanent syndication. And this presentation is thinking especially about not just long-term preservation and availability of this content, but how it can be syndicated through targeted Arweave queries, kind of emulating RSS query logic. So an example of what the knowledge commons is kind of looking at, or what a knowledge commons is looking like in the context of organizations like OpenCivics and General Forum for Ethereum Localism and Super Benefit DAO and various other groups in this kind of network. A lot of them use Quartz or Obsidian Publish. These three use Quartz. This uses Obsidian Publish to publish a wiki that's tended by a community. And they all have their own kind of editorial standards, their own like topics and themes that they focus on, and they can syndicate content because they're all based on Markdown. Someone here can write an article or a guide or a playbook for community organizing, publish that Markdown file to Arweave so that these other knowledge bases can mirror it or syndicate it. And so right now what that looks like is kind of manual, chunky stuff. Like I upload a document to Arweave and I share that transaction hash with folks at some of these other knowledge bases, and then they can choose to go download that Markdown file and then put it in the directory of their knowledge base. But can this be automated a bit more? Like, can we have something like an RSS feed that can be plugged into a Quartz stack? Quartz is open source. It's mostly TypeScript. It actually seems almost trivially easy to write some kind of querying script that functions as a plugin for Quartz that can search Arweave by some targeted querying logic, like find all uploads by this one person's address, and then select the ones that are tagged with type essay. If you wanted to get essays from a certain person in the form of Markdown files uploaded to Arweave. So hypothetically, that's kind of what a substrate like that can look like, as opposed to traditional RSS, where, at least as I understand, and if anyone knows better, please correct me, RSS would have some XML file on some privately maintained server that people can query to subscribe to content updates, whether it's a web page or a podcast. But then if that person stops maintaining that server, or that they stop paying for the URL that people are used to going to for that server, how available is that content really? And so that's where the promise of Arweave comes in, because I mean, nothing's permanent, hence plausibly permanent, but Arweave, to my knowledge, seems like the most bankable option for long-term storage of data. If you write some document or record like videos like this and want it to be available for years, Arweave, or maybe even longer, at least notionally, Arweave could be a good option. And it also provides a universal ID, like using the transaction hash of Arweave as a URI, as like a universal URI system, so that you're not depending on this kind of disparate, fragmented landscape of remembering the URLs to various other knowledge bases and trying to reconcile that. This is the main thrust of this exploration here. And I think this is a good comic that encapsulates a lot of this stuff and what we're trying to avoid with all of this. Ontologizing stuff is fun, but if we just end up with adding another standard that's competing for people's attention and requiring people who are doing important work to now like take a step back and conform to these other technical standards, is that really helping the situation? I think that's part of the logic here, is instead of trying to come up with some new standard, come up with some pattern that conforms to existing standards. And I think Arweave could be a good example for that, with just very kind of simple querying logic. So I think I have an example here. These are kind of comparing what an Arweave-based equivalent to RSS would look like. You can sort of think of it almost as a subset or a cousin of RSS. If RSS is agnostic as to the storage of the content, it could be centralized, could be decentralized. This would kind of require decentralized storage, whether it's Arweave or IPFS. But then again, IPFS, you keep paying to pin it, so it's not as conducive to long-term storage, at least as I understand. So that's sort of what the distinction is between these two syndication patterns. But you can still preserve a lot of the intuitive logic of RSS, like you're subscribing to a feed of uploads to Arweave, essentially. And you can customize that and filter it however you like, because when you upload something to Arweave, you can apply certain tags. So like say, I think I've got an example here. Say Alice is a researcher for community building, and she has this survey or this report that she does annually about community building techniques. Say she writes it in Markdown, gives it some Creative Commons license, and uploads it to Arweave every time that survey is updated with new information or new data. If she does this and applies a constant tag to those uploads, it could be essay or it could be something content specific, like a content specific UUID. Then what you have is a series of Arweave uploads from Alice's address that have some kind of semantic anchor that you can look for, like give me a feed of everything that Alice has uploaded with this content ID, and you can get the sequence of, or the version history of this report that she's writing. And then if you can integrate that into a static site builder, like Quartz, then you can maybe even have that be, that's a static site builder, so it would need to be built into the build process, but you can query Arweave every time you rebuild that site, and you can keep a page updated in like a highly syndicated way using this. It's very similar to RSS, but Arweave based. So I have a prototype here. This is just basically a Quartz fork with a very rough command line tool for bulk Arweave upload and semantic tagging. So the way that this is worked out right now is, given a directory of Markdown files, you can use front matter in those Markdown files to have a UUID generated. This comes with a basic UUID generator. So it applies a UUID to files that in your knowledge base that you want to have tagged with a UUID, and then another script that then you you have some JSON for your Arweave wallets, JSON web token, or whatever that's called. And then this script stages all of the files that you want to upload to Arweave that are tagged with that UUID, and then uploads them and applies that UUID as a tag. So then people can query Arweave for uploads from your address that have that UUID tag, and that's functionally equivalent to subscribing to a feed of those particular content items with a version history built into it. And some other bells and whistles here as well. I'm going to be updating this. Right now, it's very rough from a UX experience. Like, I'm not really a programmer. This is all just Cursor. But ideally, we can have some kind of user-friendly tool, like an Obsidian plugin, where you can select which notes in your Obsidian garden that you want to stage for an Arweave upload, and then kind of control that in a more granular way. So that's something that can be worked on to make this a bit more intuitive. And then the other thing that I think is the other half of this, because this just handles uploading files to Arweave, but how can we pull files in? Like, what if it's like Alice can use this to upload her reports to Arweave, but what would knowledge bases do if they wanted to automatically pull those in and query Arweave every time they run their site building process to update their knowledge base automatically by querying Arweave for updated content on some allow list or some query list? That's the other thing to build out. And again, I think thanks to Cursor, it seems pretty trivially easy to make. And then a couple other interesting things to look out for is if we wanted to have these knowledge bases actually hosted on Arweave, that could be possible because they're static sites. But there's just some tricky stuff with file paths and URL slugification that would need to be reconciled with how Arweave works, given if you wanted each page to be its own Arweave upload. But thankfully, there's projects like rwiki and protocol.land. Protocol.land is like an Arweave-based GitHub. So there could be existing libraries out there that would allow you to not only create these community knowledge gardens, but deploy the whole thing to Arweave so that the site is there in a plausibly permanent manner. And then a couple other interesting things. Thank you, Devansh, for showing me this one. I want to look into that a bit more. It seems like it's exploring very similar territory. And then also, if we really want to get crazy, at JournoDAO, we're working on this semantic indexing protocol called Seed Protocol, which uses Ethereum attestation service and Arweave to essentially make an on-chain knowledge graph, a social knowledge graph. And so that would be like if we wanted to take a piece of content and decompose all of its metadata into a constellation of attestations that reference each other with a built-in kind of versioning system, it would look like this. So this would be like the raw format of the markdown file. It's some, like an essay or research report. This is how Quartz would visualize it, corresponding metadata, properties, front matter properties. And then Seed Protocol would take whichever properties you identified and split them up into granular attestations, and then nest those with like a 1 degree reference to version, which would then reference the seed, which is essentially the on-chain URI for this piece of content. These are all, each one of these would be its own attestation. And so this piece of content here on-chain would be represented by a constellation of attestations, and thankfully it seems trivially inexpensive to have each one of these be its own attestation, while the actual body of the content could live on Arweave, and you can have an Arweave hash attestation that links the whole Arweave indexing system and syndication system with what could be an on-chain knowledge graph. So a lot of interesting stuff to explore there. If anyone is interested in keeping up with any of this, OpenCivics is stewarding a lot of the Knowledge Commons initiatives, and JournoDAO is where we're building Seed Protocol and Plausibly Permanent Syndication, or PPS. And you can find me here. So thank you for your attention. That's it.